Canada, late summer 1943. The gates of the Château Frontenac swing open before us. And here comes the motorcade carrying U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, welcomed by Canadian Prime Minister Mackenzie King. For a week, leaders of the Western Allies in the anti-Hitler coalition discussed joint military actions, focusing on how to halt the Japanese in the Pacific. Imperial Japan controlled more than 20 million square kilometers of Southeast Asia, with Australia and India already under the threat of invasion. The fierce combat performance of Japanese soldiers shattered the entirely false Western myth of an obsolete samurai army.
Fueled by fury, xenophobia, and a desire for vengeance, the Japanese waged a racial war against Western whites to express their hatred of the West.
Winston Churchill brought one of his best commandos to Canada. Ord Wingate had served in India, where he formed the Chindits unit. For 4 months in brutal conditions, they marched behind Japanese lines, attacking enemy bases and sowing chaos in enemy territory. Wingate argued that the guerrilla warfare experience of the Chindits definitively proved that such special forces raids could accelerate victory in Southeast Asia.
In the summer of 1943 in Quebec, a joint Anglo-American command for Southeast Asia was established, headed by Admiral of the Fleet, Lord Louis Mountbatten. On the American side, operations in Burma were led by General Joseph Stilwell, who had advised Chinese leader Chiang Kai-shek, and coordinated Lend-Lease aid.
For the Japanese, the Burma campaign was a triumph following the capture of Malaya and Singapore. The British lacked both the strength and the fighting spirit, and their retreat from Burma was swift and humiliating. The Japanese swept across the country in 127 days, fighting their way through nearly 3,000 kilometers at an average speed of 50 kilometers per day without losing a single battle. Of all their Southeast Asian colonies, the British retained only Hindustan, and the Japanese were already at its borders. The fall of Burma also severed American aid to the Chinese resistance, which had relied on the port of Rangoon and the Burma Road. The defeat of the white colonial rulers, long notorious for their condescension toward the local population, stunned the Burmese. Many welcomed the Japanese into their cities as liberators. Under Tokyo's protection, Burma declared independence on August 1, 1943, and promptly declared war on Britain and the United States. The Japanese also created a national Burmese army. Although not very powerful, it was still assistance to the imperial forces. Until 1945 they fought against the British.
After secret talks with the British, the Burma Army revolted against the Japanese on March 27, 1945. The Supreme Allied Commander in Southeast Asia, Lord Mountbatten, recognized them as an Allied party.
Returning to 1943, at that time in Burma the Japanese were assisted by Indians recruited from British prisoners of war in Malaya, as well as by the Thais. The Imperial Army approached the border with China in northern Burma and, from the airfield in Myitkyina, attacked American aerial humanitarian convoys flying to China. A great asset for the Japanese was Burma's resource stockpile. The downside was the remoteness from the metropolis. The railway played a very important role in communication.
Burma's railway network stretched for 8,000 kilometers. The most important was the Bangkok-Malmain line, where 24,000 prisoners of war died during its construction. This 385-kilometer road ran through dense jungles and difficult terrain. The route consisted of nearly 700 bridges, spanning rivers and ravines.
And it was precisely the railway and the Japanese bases near it that British and American saboteurs were to attack first. American aid arrived in India just 2 months after the meeting in Quebec. In October 1943, 3,000 volunteers stepped forward to enter battle with the Japanese in the Burmese jungles. Most of them already had experience fighting the samurai in the jungles of New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. There were soldiers among the Americans with a notorious reputation as military troublemakers who had disciplinary penalties behind them. Transferring them to Burma was a chance to restore their reputation. The American Corps was led by career intelligence officer Frank Merrill. Afterwards, the unit itself was dubbed Merrill's Marauders. Wingate was planning a major operation involving the Chindits and the American Marauders. However, these plans fell through due to the rivalry between the British and the Americans. The Yankees were not eager to place their only land unit in Burma under British command. American General Joe Stilwell, who was to lead the northern wing of the offensive in Burma, managed to have the Americans trained by Wingate transferred to his command. Thus began the history of a separate unit of American commandos, distinct from the Chindits. Merrill's marauders marched in the vanguard of Stilwell's American Chinese forces. The Japanese were preparing an invasion of India through the northern cities of Impel and Kohima. Wingate led the 77th Brigade of Royal Rifles, staffed, alongside the British, by Gurkhas and Africans. Nearly 20,000 soldiers made up the force, with some landing behind Japanese lines to force the Imperial Army to fight on two fronts. In February 1944, Wingate's Chindits began their second raid into northern Burma.
I was with the Chindit commandos. Our task was to disrupt the communications the Japanese were building as they prepared to invade India. We were supposed to blow up railway tracks, block and destroy roads.
2 other brigades were planned to be dropped by air near Indore. 3 clearings were chosen for the landing, symbolically named after the world's largest streets: Broadway in New York, Piccadilly in London, and Chowringhee Road in Calcutta. The first phase of the airborne landing involved the takeoff of 40 American C-47 transport planes. Each of them was towing 2 gliders.
The Horsa gliders, despite having a plywood construction, could still carry light field guns and bulldozers. First flew the submachine gunners, and American combat engineers, to build an airfield to handle the main landing force.
Just before takeoff, Wingate was shown fresh aerial reconnaissance photos. Logs had appeared in the main clearing, Piccadilly. Perhaps it's a Japanese trap to make plane landings impossible, the British thought. Everything quickly changed. All transport was diverted to the secondary airfield, Broadway. Around 6 p.m., the first plane with 2 gliders took off from the Chindit camp airstrip. Thus, Operation Thursday officially began. The future was uncertain. The horses were not reliable. Several gliders crashed in the jungle. 5 horses released too early and landed right near a Japanese headquarters. The Japanese misjudged enemy saboteurs at the doorstep as a disruption to the Indian border offensive.
We were lured into an ambush. The Japanese kept shouting, "Tommy! Tommy!" They shouted to provoke us into exposing ourselves so they could wipe us out.
The Japanese did not scour the jungle in search of the rest of the British. Upon approaching Broadway, several transport planes crashed. A traffic jam formed on the short runway, into which the following horses began crashing. By morning, the British landing site resembled a graveyard. Overall, during this phase of Operation Thursday, more than 100 soldiers died from failed landings. Besides the casualties, equipment was wrecked too, which meant widening the runway would have to be done with whatever was available, most likely by hand. But the Chindits coped with this task. Planes and gliders of the second landing wave began touching down at Broadway. Meanwhile, the Chowringhee Road airstrip couldn't be kept secret from the enemy, but the British managed to unload and clear out just before Japanese aircraft bombed the site. General Mutaguchi learned about the landing at Broadway a week later, on March 13. By that time, they had enough time to airlift 9,000 British troops 200 kilometers behind the Imperial Army's lines. Wingate split them into 30 independent columns. Each column had a radio operator who directed air support onto targets and radioed coordinates for the evacuation planes.
At the sound of a shot we dove into the jungle. My friend, an engineer, shouted, "I've tripped a trap." I stepped over it, but unfortunately, he was caught. This tripwire could easily blow a leg off. But fortunately, we managed to get him first aid and evacuate him back to base.
The godfather of the Chindits, Ord Wingate, personally flew out to visit all his columns and coordinate their actions. On March 24, while returning to base, his plane crashed under mysterious circumstances, deep in the jungle near Impel. After repelling several British attacks on Indore, the Japanese launched an offensive against the Chindit bases of White City and Aberdeen. Without air support, the commandos' light weapons wouldn't have been enough to hold off a much larger enemy. The Japanese eventually withdrew, suffering heavy losses. The Chindits' sabotage forced Mutaguchi to divert up to 5,000 troops to eliminate the British. They were drawn from reserves meant to reinforce the offensive against Impel and Kohima. Gurkha volunteers from Nepal truly excelled in the jungle.
The Gurkhas were running behind a vehicle. One of the enemy soldiers jumped out from behind it. They slashed his neck and cut off his head. As it happened, the head hit the ground first, followed by the body.
Allied Supreme Commander Lord Mountbatten backed the initiative of the Americans, who were advancing from the north and demanding reinforcements. As a result, the Chindits were turned around and sent north to join General Stilwell. Some 16th Brigade soldiers, who had spent the longest behind enemy lines, were evacuated. The rest of the British commandos came under American command. Now their task was to draw away part of the Japanese forces to ease the advance of Stilwell's units from the north. The primary objective was the town of Myitkyina. From an airfield nearby, the Japanese attacked American air convoys. On their way north, the Chindits mined bridges and fought off Mutaguchi's pursuers.
You constantly hauling something, dragging yourself up and down and get weaker by the minute.
They had to fight not only the Japanese, but the fickle climate, the jungle, and tropical fevers. During this raid, a tragedy occurred that is hard to comprehend. With no way to evacuate or help 19 severely wounded comrades, their fellow soldiers eventually agreed to put an end to their suffering.
The bond between a healthy person and a wounded one is so strong that you have to do something. You can't just get up and run away, leaving the person behind. I leaned over the lying scout, pressed a pistol to the top of his head, and shot him through the brain. His eyes widened and stared at me. I closed them.
By early summer, the Chindits were exhausted by combat and illness, but there was no rotation. Stilwell issued new orders after his offensive stalled near Myitkyina. Although the Americans captured the airfield, the Japanese turned the town into a bristling citadel. To cut it off from Mutaguchi's other forces, Stilwell ordered the British to capture Mogong, a small town near Myitkyina. The British were less than 70 kilometers away from the Americans. For the assault on the Japanese fortified area, the Chindits had only light weapons. No artillery, no tanks, which led to heavy losses. After 3 weeks of bloody battles, the British managed to drive the Japanese out of Mogong.
During the battle for Mogong, the Chindits lost 800 fighters. That constituted nearly half those who took part.
When Stilwell gave a new order to push toward Myitkyina and take part in the assault alongside the Americans, the Chindits ignored it. Admiral Mountbatten saved them from a court-martial. The special commissions sent by the command to check the Chindits' combat readiness were shocked. Out of the brigade's 2,000 fighters, only 112 were healthy, the rest showed signs of various ailments or wounds, had suffered from malaria, and were unfit for battle. It was decided to withdraw the Chindits from the front line for recovery. By the summer of 1944, the Japanese advance toward Impel and Kohima had stalled. Mutaguchi's exhausted forces could no longer push forward. They began retreating from northeastern Burma. Meanwhile, the Allied counteroffensive was gathering speed. The last Chindits left Burma in late August 1944. Over 6 months of raiding in the Burmese jungles, they lost nearly 5,000 killed and wounded, and 6,000 to illness. Under such conditions, the Chindits could no longer fight on as a separate unit. They were disbanded. At the same time, the 6-month campaign in northern Burma glorified the Chindits' strength of spirit. Their courage and endurance inspired thousands of fighters in the Pacific. Japanese troops left Burma in August 1945. The war was coming to an end. Fighting was taking place on the Japanese home islands.